So I want to wrap up just a little bit of our discussion so far with looking at the various um, approaches to ethics in the modern world, kind of non-religious, secular, um, modernist in some ways, we might say. But what I said was kind of the magical and mechanical, and I mentioned in that the sort of power-based, rule obedience versus natural law, the idea of becoming the good person so that you can know how to behave well. Um, I don't want to imply that a virtue ethic approach doesn't value rules. Every religious system is going to have rules. Every ethical system is going to have rules. The question is, what's the point of the rules? What what do we do with the rules? What is are the rules themselves central? Where do the rules come from? Right. For the virtue ethic, the rules are sort of rules of thumb to help you understand and begin to apply principles that you may not understand, right? So the goal is not that you learn all the rules and make 1,000 more rules so that you have a rule for everything. That's virtually impossible. Utilitarianism is going to say, well, no, you've got to do the calculation and either do the calculation every time, so you have to create a rule for every instance of an ethical decision, or you have to have sort of a follow the rule utilitarianism, which whenever we come up with a sort of new situation, then we have to do calculation to come up with a new rule, and then we can follow the rules, and the rules are gonna be based on this sort of the most pleasure, the least pain. But that's the rule that you should follow. Or, um, you know, egoism is going to tell you, well, here are some of the basic rules, like the government can't do this, the government can't do that. The question is, who do the rules mostly apply to? Are the rules more about what the individual can and can't do, or more about what the corporate group can and can't do? Um, but the rules are based on and subject to whoever sort of has the power. Um, and so rules are sort of ultimate, oftentimes, and even in sort of divine command systems, right? Divine command we'll get into more in the next part as we get into the Euthyphro. It's not that within a virtue system you don't have divine commands, or you don't have divine direction, or you don't have divinely established rules. The question is, how far do the rules go? How do we relate to the rules? Um, and a virtue ethic is going to say, rules are good, they're useful, they're helpful for some of the basics, for the young, for the new to reality, for those who don't understand the nature of life, who don't understand the sort of virtues and values of temperance and justice, or don't understand how to apply it. You can have some basic, sort of general overarching rules that help you begin on the path. So, like the Ten Commandments, or in Buddhism, there's like five basic rules of life, right? Um, how you relate to others. Just things like not murdering, not stealing, not um, not engaging in adultery or sort of flippant approach to sexuality. Um, these things within a virtue system are not the end all be all. They are sort of shorthand to start teaching virtues and self-control. It's to basically say, look, at the very least, you need to understand that if you're temperate, if you're going to be a temperate person, if you're going to be a just person, here's a place to start. Um, and you might develop other rules based on these or related to these, but you're going to have to at some point know how to interact when rules seem to come into conflict, or when you don't have a rule, right? You can't make a rule for every situation. So the virtue ethic is going to say, you have to know how to be a good person so that you know how to act in the situation where you don't have a rule, or the rules aren't clear, or where the rules might seem to conflict, right? So in the Hebrew and Christian biblical accounts, right there, well, there's actually one story that sort of pulls together the whole of both sides. Jews were not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Like very specific, don't work, take a Sabbath day. Trust God enough that you take a day where you don't work, where you leave everything to God. The point of that rule is to bless humanity, to recognize that God loves, cares for you, and you don't have to always strive and strain. You can trust God, and you should for your own well being. And so you shouldn't engage in normal work, in normal labor of life. You have to let some things go. Um, but one day, uh, Jesus and his disciples, who are all Jewish, right? They're Jewish, they're in Israel. Um, they're on a short walk, has to be a short walk because it's a Sabbath day. They're on a short walk on the Sabbath, and there's some grain beside the road. That grain is beside the road as in obedience to a rule. What's the rule? If you're wealthy and you have a planted field, you're supposed to leave the very edges of the field not harvested. For who? Well, for people who are on long journeys or who are not at their own homes, who are stuck somewhere that's not home, sojourners, or for people who are poor and don't have enough money and don't have enough food. It's the edges of the field are to be left for the provision for the poor. And so Jesus and his disciples, they've come into a new place. It's the Sabbath. They can't travel very far. They're trying to keep the Sabbath, but they're not anywhere that they have sort of a home. So there's this field beside them. They pick some grain, they rub it between their hands, and they eat it. And the Pharisees come up and say, "Your disciples are working on the Sabbath. Shame on you. You're not good Jews. You're sinning. The Sabbath day is you're supposed to rest." And Jesus essentially says, "Haven't you heard what David did with the bread that was only intended for the feast?" And this is pointing back to a story in the Hebrew Scriptures, in what the Christians consider the Old Testament, where David and his men are running for their life. They come across the tabernacle of God. They're about to starve. They're about to faint, and if they faint, they're going to be killed. Um, they're people in need, right? And so they come to the priest at the tabernacle and they say, "We need some bread. We're in need. We're desperate. Uh, we're going to collapse and we're going to die. Please save us." And the priest says, "Well, the only bread I have is the bread that goes in the tabernacle before God's presence, and the only people who are supposed to eat that are Levites." That's the priestly class, the priestly tribe. Uh, what am I going to do? I have a command from God to care for the poor and not let people die. I have a command from God that um, only the priests are supposed to eat this bread. So what does he do? He says, "Tell me this. Have you so the priest who eats this bread, the Levite who eats this bread, is only supposed to eat it under certain holy, pure, ceremonially pure conditions, which is part of that is that you haven't had sexual relations. It's not that sexual relations are seen as bad; they're just not fully clean. So before you enter the presence of God, you're supposed to not have sexual relations for like a full day." And David's like, "No, we've been traveling. Like you don't have wives with us. We're not having, we're not out here having sex with anybody. We've been traveling for days. We're about to starve." And so the priest says, "Okay, I'll give you some of this special bread so that you don't starve to death." What's the priest doing? He's trying to balance. I have two laws here that seem in this moment to be in conflict. They're clearly stated rules, but to keep one is to violate the other. So I have to determine which is of the higher value, which matters more to God. What is the purpose of these rules, right? The purpose of recognizing the holiness of God's bread is, to maintain proper respect for God, and it's dangerous to not respect the presence of God. But it would also be dangerous to not respect the rules of God, the command of God to care for the person in need, and to allow for this person made in the image of God to starve to death while I'm sitting here withholding bread would be a far worse thing. So that virtue ethic says this is possible. So what Jesus is saying is, look, you know, you Pharisees, you've kind of made a slew of rules around the command to keep the Sabbath day, and you're missing the whole point of the Sabbath day. You're missing the whole point of God showing His provision for people this field edges for gleaning for by the poor and the sojourner. That's so that right so that people recognize that God is provider ultimately. Um, so a virtue ethic, Buddhism has certain rules, but the rules aren't about merely keeping the rules. They're about preparing yourself for the Eightfold Path, which is about getting into a right state of mind to achieve nirvana. Right? It's towards a goal, um, and so it's this is that's how virtue ethic works. There are rules, but the rules are rooted in something higher, something more, some deeper purpose. It's not just about rule keeping. Oftentimes, a mechanical approach, once it produces a rule or embraces a rule, it's very absolutist. Virtue ethic is very objective, but not necessarily absolutist, right? We talked about objective versus relative or subjective versus absolutist, right? When I said, like, you shouldn't steal, right? Stealing is not good. But, we see a difference between someone taking, a piece of fruit or a piece of bread or something that's not theirs because they're about to starve to death and there's no one around to ask, or a young child, stealing for the sake of saving a sibling's life when they have no other way or they perceive no other way and their lack of kind of maturity and wisdom. They don't know who to ask, they're scared, whatever. We see the difference between that and, say, some rich person who goes out and steals things from people because they think it's fun and exciting. Right? There's a difference between those. We see that difference. Or we could even see an instance where stealing something might even be okay. So, like, if you're an enemy combatant behind enemy lines and you're fighting somebody like the Nazis and you steal something from them, right, to escape, or you steal something from them that might stop them from doing more harm. Is stealing bad? Sure, stealing is bad. You shouldn't steal, but at the same time, you're doing something to bring about a greater good. And the good is not merely based on pleasure or safety or enjoyment, but it's based on some higher reality, the value of human beings' lives, the value, something, right? So virtue ethic is saying there are values and their values relate to each other, and rules should be rooted in those values. And rules, there are some objectively solid rules that we shouldn't break, but it's not, rules are not end all be all. Rules are in the context of the excellence of virtue, of becoming a good person. And if you become a good person, you'll by nature know how to sort of govern your own life consistently. And that governing of your own life will reflect the principles that are embodied in those larger rules. This is based on the idea of what is good is based in what is real, right? The rules in the virtue ethics system are not capricious. It's not like God had a bad day one day and said, don't do this, or God doesn't want you to have fun, or the universe is just trying to screw with you, or whatever you want to say, right? That any rule that's created in a virtue system is rooted in the fact that reality is such that certain things are good and certain things are not good. So every rule is intended to draw your attention to, or help you in a sort of shorthand way relate to that good, which relates to the reality, to the natural order of things as they're created to be or intended to be from their inception, from the source of what makes everything, right? Um, so then all that to say, when we get to things like the Crito, and any references you see are from that Allen translation. Again, I forgot to change that in this. I usually teach this in an in-person class where we use the Allen translation. I just felt like in the online course, it's easier just to use the online sources. But I'll try to reference enough of the content from the Crito that you can kind of find it and remember it if you've read well. There's this idea oftentimes, in relation to rules and such. There's this idea in the Crito that modern scholars will often say, well, the Crito is about Socrates' sort of idea that you should always obey the laws of the land. and that you should never disobey the laws, right? And it's like a modern or an Enlightenment idea of this is the first instance of contract theory of law. By living in a society, you are complicit in a contract relationship to the larger society. It's binding on you, and you should never disobey it. Um, but if we take like Plato's writing seriously, and if we take Socrates as his character in the dialogues as being consistent, that can't be what the Crito is about. It is clearly about the discussion of laws. You can't deny that, right? It talks about the law in relation to the eternal law. Um, but it's not about you have to always follow the laws of the land, which is the reason why, why is Socrates in prison? He's in prison because he said, I will not violate conscience. I will not violate the good of obeying what? Obeying the messenger from the God. I have this messenger that comes from the God and has instructed me to try to convince Athens of its own corruption and laziness, to sort of be the gadfly that inspires the lazy horse of state to wake up and be what it really is intended to be. There's that sort of virtue idea, right? The state of Athens is intended to be a just and great society made up of just and noble people, and yet it's corrupt, it's become lazy, it's become abusive and oppressive, and that's not good. And so Socrates, have been called by the God to sort of inspire you to get rid of your sort of corruption and your injustice, and to seek to live temperate and holy and good lives in proper relationship to the gods and each other, because the gods, as Socrates understands them, are divine, and we'll see that they're not corrupt. They're not like the gods of mythology. We'll see that when we get to the Euthyphro. We'll talk about that more. But if Socrates and if Plato are consistent in their writing, which they seem to be if you read dialogue after dialogue after dialogue, the Crito isn't about obeying the command of the land no matter what. It is about recognizing the authority of temporal laws, right? Because what is Socrates doing? He essentially says, look, I cannot do anything other than what I'm doing in obedience to God and the messenger from the God, right? It is, and what I have learned in that obedience is that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it. And in fact, at one point, Socrates says, I can't find any way to bridge the gap between people like me, who really truly think it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, and those who, like Callicles, say you should get all you can and amass more, and desire more and amass more, and that justice and injustice are nothing real, and the tyrant is the most enviable of people because the tyrant can have everything they want, right? The Crito is essentially summing up in this opening statement of Socrates, right? Look, Crito, either I'm right and it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, or Callicles is right. He doesn't mention Callicles, but that's essentially the viewpoint that he contrasts with. There's no kind of truce between my way, better to suffer injustice, and Callicles' way, better to get all you can, even to commit injustice to get all you want. And so it's this question of the laws. Should I escape? Should I break the law and break out of prison? And this is why a lot of scholars say, well, see, it's you should always obey the law of the land. But it would seem to be, no, Socrates is following the higher law. Better to suffer injustice than to commit it. I have not committed an injustice. I have only done what is true and good in speaking truth to you. You haven't proven to me, you haven't shown me, right? We'll read the Apology, but when you read the Apology, it should be noted that Socrates is accused of impiety. We'll find this also when we read the Euthyphro very soon. He's accused of impiety, unholiness, of not following the gods of the state. And he admits to, yeah, I don't think the gods are warring with each other. I don't think gods are raping and murdering and starting wars and fighting with each other, because gods are divine, and divine means perfect, and perfect means peaceful, temperate, self-controlled, and just. So if the gods are divine by definition, and they're divine by definition, then they're peaceful, temperate, self-controlled, and just, then those stories that Homer tells about one god fighting another, and one god looking at some woman and raping her and taking her as his own, or one goddess, stirring up jealousy between two men because of something she wants, that can't be true. That's not what gods are like. God is good. God is just. God is holy, and therefore, um, you know, I'm not going to commit injustice, but I'm going to do what the God tells me. At the same time, if the legal authorities, they're here, they may be imperfect, but they're here, I have obligation to them. So if they tell me what I'm doing is wrong, but they can't prove to me it's wrong, then I need to keep doing it if it's true and good. And if they want to punish me for doing the true and the good, I will take the punishment. I'll suffer the injustice. I will not commit the injustice. This is the thing that Socrates will not violate. In refusing to escape prison, he's not saying, yeah, there's no law to break ever. He's saying that virtue and truth demand that I not commit an injustice, even if an injustice has been committed to me. So what's he recognizing? The law has unjustly placed me in prison and sentenced me to death. But I'm not going to stop doing what I know I'm supposed to do, but I'm not going to violate a law. I was put in here technically legally by authorities, even if they're exercising their power wrongly. I'll suffer that injustice before I'll commit my own injustice and disregard it. Why? Because what happens to society if everybody disregards the law? What happens, Crito, if we pay the guard, if we bribe the guard to let me go? Because after all, I'm innocent. Well, what if the next guy claims to be innocent and he wants to bribe the guard, and the next guy and the next guy? What I'm doing, Socrates essentially is saying, is I'm teaching this guard to be unjust, to be unreliable, to be untrue, to be corrupt. So, no, I'm not going to bribe a guard to get out of here. That's promoting injustice. Even for the sake, he's essentially saying the ends does not justify the means. Furthermore, he says, there's an obligation to the laws like to your parents. It doesn't mean that your parents are perfect, but there's some familial connection, right? So my question is, a lot of people say, well, the Crito it's contract theory of law, just like Hobbes or Rousseau or Montesquieu or someone like that. But is it really? Because Hobbes and Rousseau clearly are talking about individuals that are totally separated and individual and on their own and at war with each other, having to make an agreement to maintain some kind of peace and order. Socrates is talking about a different kind of obligation, right? You're born into a family. You're part of a family. It's a natural connection. It's a tie that isn't merely an arranged agreement that you sign on to, right? Families often do things for each other that are not merely governed by sort of reciprocity and trade-offs and contractual arrangements and bargaining, right? You didn't bargain to get your parents. You didn't bargain to get the upbringing your parents gave you. And quite honestly, when your parents give you a good upbringing or a bad one, they're not likely doing that with the idea of, well, if I'm really good to you, you'll probably be good to me when I'm old and can't take care of myself. Well maybe, but at the end of the day, how do you even prove that? How do you govern that? The obligations between parents and children is something very different than what Rousseau or Hobbes is talking about, because it's based in a natural relational order. Remember from the Gorgias, we talked about the point of friendship and fellowship in Socrates, right? The nature of humanity is communal, not in the sense of you should always sacrifice your individual everything for the sake of the whole community, but that the health of the individual and the health of the community, the justice of the individual and the justice of community are integrally related to one another. There's a deep connection between them, right? And then finally, Socrates reveals something that's consistently throughout his dialogues, is this idea of an eternal law and an eternal judgment. And he says, if I face the final judgment and I've disregarded the sort of little brothers, the temporal laws, how am I going to face the eternal laws? There's a connection there, he sees. And ultimately, his unchanged vision is what's important is the health of the soul, and the health of the soul depends upon the commitment to the idea of what it's better to suffer injustice than to commit one. But I would contend that this is a very different in many ways, so there are some surface similarities with other contract theories. When Socrates is talking about a contract, he's not talking about what Hobbes is talking about. He's not talking about what Rousseau is talking about. It is integrally different. It is essentially different than the sort of post-Enlightenment contract theory of government. It's much more like family. The idea of the obligations here are much more like friendship and relational, and less like simply bargaining chips to maintain some sort of pseudo-peaceful order that lets me get what I want. And that's not what Socrates is talking about here. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We understand, because I think Socrates in some ways captures something that most of the religious traditions are going to hold to when you look at the sort of virtue wisdom side of the various religious traditions. You're going to see that Socrates shuns the fear of death because really, what's the logic of fearing death? If you are just and there is something after death, then that something will be governed by a just judge. If there is nothing after death, then, well, what you have is being just fulfills your obligation and allows for you to have a sort of inner peace, and death is nothing more than just merely going to sleep, and who would fear going to sleep? And if you've lived a right life, then you've left a good heritage of just living, and you need not fear for your offspring because you've lived the life in community, and you've taught justice, right? So something else to keep in mind when you talk about his understanding, when he talks about law and obedience and justice, it's in relation to a calling that he has. He talks about in the Apology. We'll get to this later. We'll come back to it more, but at the end of the term, where he has a sense of a calling that God has sent him to be the gadfly that calls, that really calls Athens to be just and right and good. So this is the question. This is the issue in the Crito. This is the issue throughout, and this is at the heart of that difference between the wisdom tradition and the sort of wisdom and virtue tradition versus sort of the mechanical, legalistic, rule-centric, secular, non-religious or power central approaches. There is obviously a difficulty that we see in the fact that if you take a virtue approach, not every virtue approach is in agreement on everything. There's going to be disagreement. There's disagreement. We'll talk about this after we talk about the similarities in the religious traditions. We'll talk about the differences, core root differences, not just surface differences between the different religions. These are important to keep in mind when we think about virtue traditions and religious traditions. Socrates is not ignorant of that difficulty. We'll see that when we look at the Euthyphro. And a lot of Socrates is about, look, I don't understand it all, but we should come together and ask the questions and pursue the truth together in community, in cooperation. So that's a big part of what Socrates is doing. And then in some ways is a big part of the virtue and wisdom traditions that we see, that I think Socrates in Plato's dialogues is a reflection of, or a mirror of, or maybe an example of. So, up to this point, basically some of the things we've talked about. We're going to be moving to part 2 soon, but some basic moral assumptions of modern world, questions about facts versus values, and some of the flaws in our inherited assumptions as modern people. The question of what is human nature? Is there good for humanity? Something that's good based in our reality? How does reality impact what is good? Um, the different modern Western approaches to morality and why they tend to fail. Um, and we've talked about this idea of our narratives and how they shape us. I can only answer the question of what am I to do if I can answer the prior question, what story or stories do I find myself a part? This goes back to that issue of what's real versus what's good, right? And so if we're thinking about what's real and what's good, I often like to have discussions in a class. We won't have this one here. We might have a short discussion of it later, but I've got to see how much room we have for further discussion and still be able to get all the material covered in this 6-week session. But oftentimes in the class we have a class discussion about the issues of pornography and then psychedelics, right? What's good, what's allowable, what's right, what's just in relation to certain things. From a virtue tradition, the question is what's real, right? If something is real, that'll affect our understanding of whether or not it's good. So, pornography. Is pornography okay? Well, what is it to be human? What is sexuality? What's the point of sexuality? What's the purpose of sexuality? How should I sexually relate to other people? How should I treat other people? How do I recognize in the humanity of another? Is it proper to use another human as a means only and not an end, right? Is pornography always using a person as a means only and not an end? To be Kantian about it. Or from the Judeo-Christian perspective, are humans made in the image of God, and therefore sexuality is a precious and valuable thing as this sort of central to the construction of family and the building of a solid society, in which case pornography is an abuse of the image of God and a destructive force among families? Or is sex just about having fun? And if everybody's willing, then it's okay. It doesn't matter, right? What's real determines what's right and what's wrong. Or with psychedelics, there's some research on psychedelics in use with fighting depression. Actually, the researchers who are involved in it have a sort of Hindu Buddhist approach to the spiritual realities. And here's what I mean. In Hinduism and Buddhism, well, in Buddhism, really Buddhism is more essentially related, right? In Buddhism, everything is illusion. There's no reality. So every spiritual impression, every spiritual entity is merely just a part of the illusion. It's all rooted in sort of elements of your consciousness. And so in Buddhism, if you are confronted with a demon, you should not be scared. You shouldn't fight it. You shouldn't fear it. You shouldn't agree with it. You should just investigate it, right? Well, in the research on psychedelics in relation to treating depression, the researchers have used psychedelics to help people achieve a certain alternate state of consciousness, and in that alternate state, some of them have experiences that seem like confrontations with spiritual beings, some of them seemingly demonic. And the researchers say, well, just don't be scared, don't run away, don't flee from it. Investigate it, see what it is. Let's talk through it. Let's see what this is. Well, if the sort of psychiatric Buddhist approach that everything that's going on here is merely something happening in your mind, there's some dark corner of your mind that you need to investigate and sort of flesh out to get rid of, then that's a great approach. Go investigate it. Let's look at it. Let's think it through. If there are real entities called demons that are spirits that actually hate you and want to destroy you, and you've opened up access to them, well, then there might be a better approach to them, right? What's real determines what's good, right? When I mentioned the problem of Ayn Rand's approach. She talks about rational self-interest. Well, for her, what's real is just what's physical, which gives problems for her understanding of what rational self-interest looks like. I won't go back and rehash all that, but what you see as real affects what you see as good. And what you see as good is dependent upon what is actually real. If you're wrong about the real, then you may be wrong about the good, and then you won't know how to act properly. You may do something dangerous, right? That's the issue we need to get at. That's at the heart of the virtue and wisdom tradition, is we need to understand the reality of the world around us to some degree in order to understand what's good for us as humans, in order to understand how we should behave.